I'm going to play you Whitney Houston's version now of the Star-Spangled Banner. And I want you to listen to it. And then I'm going to play you a clip from a film. This film is called The Sum of All Fears. Has anybody seen it? It stars Ben Affleck in an adaptation of a Tom Clancy novel. And you'll see immediately why I'm playing you the clip. I want you to look at it and tell me what you notice about it. All right? So let's first listen to Whitney. All right. So what did you notice about that? Yeah.
In both versions, they had drums, kind of like the military drums.
In both versions, they had drums. Okay. What did you mean? What do you mean by both versions?
I mean, like in the third floor.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Was it different stanza of the poem that he was singing?
Very good. What he sang in the film clip was not the Star-Spangled Banner. It was verse 4 of The Defense of Fort McHenry, which was the poem from which the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, is taken. And most people don't realize that, in fact, the Star-Spangled Banner is only one verse of a longer poem that was written after a battle during the War of 1812. And one of the things I'm going to try to argue for you in the course of the hour is that people have said the Star-Spangled Banner, maybe that shouldn't be the national anthem, and not only because it's hardly singable by any normal human being. You ever try singing it before a ball game? It's very difficult, especially when somebody's doing it up in a high key with a lot of flourishes on top. And actually, there's a good reason to think that it shouldn't be the national anthem, seeing as it comes from a British drinking song. But okay. But also, people say, well, it's about war. And why should our national anthem be about war? Shouldn't we have something like, God Bless America or America the Beautiful, something that celebrates the land? And what I want to suggest to you is that it's only in part a poem that is about war. And that what it also is, in fact, what I'll suggest to you is what it primarily is a poem about the process of enlightenment. Now, we might decide that for other reasons we don't want to have a poem that's about enlightenment to be the national anthem, but I think we should think about that in a different way. Okay? So one of the things I want to do for you today is sketch briefly what we mean by enlightenment. We didn't have the lecture last week on Edwards, which is usually where I would introduce the concept of enlightenment. And just so that you all remember, I'm going to do that lecture next Monday for those of you who can attend at 12:30 in this room, so right before our normal meeting time, and then we'll go from that, we'll have a break, and then we'll go into the lecture that's about the American Enlightenment, Franklin and Jefferson. But I'll tell you a little bit about the Enlightenment now. This should, in some sense, remind you of things that you've done in the supplementary reading, particularly that piece by Leonard Marsack. But the Enlightenment, you might say, is a moment of profound intellectual and cultural change. And one way of thinking about the Enlightenment that I think might be useful for us is to think of it in terms of that model of dominant, residual, and emergent cultures that I mentioned and have been talking about since the beginning of the term, right? In which there is a kind of dominant consensus that becomes, you might say, the core of a culture. And that dominant consensus is always part of a process. It's always changing. It's always fending off challenges. Challenges from older belief systems that might still be around. Challenges from newer belief systems. So in the context of our course, we might say that the dominant culture in the 17th century, where we've been spending a lot of our time recently, has to do with something that has to do with religious experience, particularly in New England and the Northeast with Calvinism, American Puritanism. But at the same time, there's a whole other set of intellectual developments that are going on in an accelerated way in England and the continent, but eventually they make their way over here. And we'll talk about it a little bit more next week. But it's a culture of what we might call belles lettres, right? And with it a kind of which literally means beautiful letters, but in a certain way it means kind of fine writing. Writing for almost its own sake. Belletristic writing is often the kind of essay writing that we would associate with somebody in the English context like Joseph Addison, for example. That is a thing that is happening at the same time as Jonathan Edwards is being educated in a school for ministers called Yale. And one of the things that happens to Edwards is he happens to read some of John Locke. I'll talk a little bit more about this next time. And he kind of sees all of a sudden something very exciting in Locke and something really scary. Because Edwards is raised as a kind of old-time Calvinist. In fact, he's even a little bit more doctrinaire than his uncle, who was a famous preacher, but who was pushing Calvinist doctrine a little bit towards the Enlightenment, Samuel Stoddard. Edwards, in some sense, retrenches and wants to become conservative, but he sees what we might think of as a kind of emergent culture around the ideas of the Enlightenment, which is clearly going to pose a threat to the old-time religion. Right? I mean, he's going to realize that if he wants to continue to preach in a Calvinist way and to sustain Calvinist belief, he has got to find a way to retrofit it, to take this new technology and make it compatible with, or at least not a threat to, the Calvinism in which he so firmly believes. So Edwards becomes this very strange cusp figure. And one of the things to remember about Edwards is that he's almost exactly the contemporary of Benjamin Franklin. I mean, the two men basically, Franklin lives longer because Edwards dies prematurely of smallpox, but they're living at the same time. And they are both looking to strike a balance between old-time ideas that grow out of New England Puritanism and other forms of religion and religious influence up and down the eastern seaboard, and this newer idea of the Enlightenment. And one of the things we would say, therefore, about the shift that takes place with the Enlightenment is really about moving away from a conception of the primary drama of human life being spiritual and taking place, you might say, in God's consciousness, to the primary drama of human life taking place in our own consciousnesses, right? It becomes an anthropocentric, human-centered understanding of the nature of the universe. And different Enlightenment thinkers will try to square that with a belief in God in different ways. Some people like John Locke will find it completely compatible with belief in a deity, and in a Christian deity particularly. I mean, you could say that, well, Locke would say revelation, miracles, that kind of way of attaining knowledge, that's still, if you can get that, that's the best way. Comes direct down the pipeline from heaven, that's the best way to get knowledge. But how often does that happen? How often does it happen in modern 17th century times? Not so often. So it's not the most reliable way to get knowledge. On the other hand, if God gave us souls, God gave us the mind, God gave us everything that comes with them. He gave us the power to reason. So there's a sense in which the power to reason is divine, and we ought to make use of it. So there's no incompatibility for somebody like Locke between belief in God and, you might say, using human reason to discern things about truths, larger scientific principles, understandings of the way the world works. Now, obviously, that's a big shift from the Puritans, and one of the premises, obviously, is that we're not going to automatically believe that the world is somehow depraved and completely unreliable, and that we, as human beings, are depraved and unreliable. We're going to say, no, in fact, we're connected to God, and therefore there is, in some sense, a divine sanction for things like scientific research and scientific belief. Some Enlightenment thinkers go even further. They become atheists, you might say, and we'll talk about Franklin's particular take on this next time. But one of the things we might see is there's kind of a spectrum of responses. But all of these are part of a larger trend in thought in which we might say the human consciousness, after Descartes, the human consciousness is where the action is. It's what becomes the center, you might say, of culture in a way that it hadn't been before. So there's a number of principles that we might think of when we think about the Enlightenment. But one of the most important I want us to understand is that many of these thinkers think of Enlightenment not as an end result, but constantly as a process. And in that sense, the way that people like Kant even have talked about Enlightenment is very compatible with this idea of a model of culture that is constantly in flux and part of a process, right? Dominant, residual, emergent culture struggling to control and be persuasive, to create new practices that will become the dominant practices. That is compatible with this idea of enlightenment. So one of the famous statements about the Enlightenment comes from Kant. And you can look at the way, I mean, he even uses a term that sounds similar to this idea of the emergent, although it's not the same term. Emergence. Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. And automatically you can see that it's the self that becomes the most important thing. It isn't emergence from, the state of nature or from, the ignorance of Garden of Eden. It's self-incurred. Why? Because he says immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore sapere aude, which literally translated from the Latin would mean dare to be wise, right? Have courage to use your own understanding. And when we get to Ralph Waldo Emerson, you'll see why many people have regarded Emerson as a kind of Kantian thinker, somebody who has taken a lot of the transcendentalist philosophy that is associated with Kant and other German, primarily, thinkers, and somehow domesticated it, made it suitable for an American audience. But that idea of have courage to use your own understanding, that could easily be paraphrased, a paraphrase for Emerson's entire essay, Self-Reliance. Right? So Emerson is all about the problem for Emerson would be something like self-distrust, being afraid to trust yourself. Right? So we'll talk about that, and I want to sort of lay that note out there for you to listen to now, and we'll strike the note again later on. Jefferson, some 40 years later, after we might say the American Enlightenment has become the dominant culture, has become the dominant consensus, reflects back on it, and he says this in 1826, all eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. These are grounds of hope for others. What's he talking about here? What's he actually referring to? First of all, the metaphor. What's the metaphor? Yes, a horse. Who is the horse? Mankind is the horse. Good. And who's riding mankind, therefore? Yes, I heard it. The favored few, booted and spurred. Who are the favored few? Excuse me? I think what he's suggesting is that enlightenment is a process that will allow these people to no longer be the horse. Right? So it really wouldn't be the enlightened. Could you do me a favor? Shut the door. Thanks. It wouldn't be the enlightened. Who would the favored few be who have this? What's that? Well, I guess if you were a Puritan, it would be the elect. And I suppose you might say, if you were thinking, I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's good insofar as if you're thinking, give it a kick. If you are, several kicks. Booted and spurred. There you go. Thank you very much. If you are thinking from a Puritan standpoint, you would say, yeah, actually, the Puritans think of themselves as the favored few. They have the grace of God. And who are they riding and spurring? Probably the native slaves, all various other and sundry non-elect people. So that's good. Although I'm not sure that's what Jefferson has in mind. But it's good for our course. Yes?
The aristocracy.
Yeah, the aristocracy, and maybe kings as well, right? I mean, the divine right of kings, the aristocrats, are supposedly given divine sanction, right? Remember, go back to your Winthrop. Inequality is something that is given by God. It's part, and Winthrop comes up with these arguments about mutual obligation, the promotion of charity that says that this is why God has created this system. But exactly the divine right of kings. I mean, one of the things that we'll talk about a little later on is the way in which Locke's second treatise of government is really designed to make the counter argument and prepare the way for this, you might say. In the aftermath of the English Revolution, Hobbes creates a justification, an understanding of the state which says, like, look, he's really trying to create order, and he says, you know, everybody's born, yeah, but what happens is once you're born, you immediately kind of delegate your authority to this larger thing, and he calls it the Leviathan, by which he means the state, which is personified the king. So effectively, everything belongs to the king. Locke comes up with a rationale for understanding why everything does not belong to the king. Even if you have a king, the king doesn't own everything. Property has a different basis than the divine right of kings. We will get to that, but it has everything to do with property in the body. You have property in the body first. Because you have property in the body, you own your own labor. When you mix your labor with nature, you get more property that's yours. Right? That's the theory behind it. And that means that God has, sanctified kings, but not given them everything. What the Enlightenment, taking that as a starting point, Jefferson is looking around and says, look, with the ideas of the Enlightenment, what we are seeing is, first of all, he talks about the rights of man. And again, that would be, in many, many cases, it's philosophically justified through property rights. The idea of science, and constantly Enlightenment thinkings are using the actual metaphor of light itself, the light of science. Because of the light of science, you can see better. When you see better, you get this truth. And what the truth is, the one that's fundamental for him, is that Enlightenment means we need to get rid of aristocracy. And that's why the most enlightened country is the United States in this early national period. Not a favored few who are going to ride them legitimately by the grace of God, but in fact, Jefferson will believe in a certain kind of meritocracy, right? So that those who have certain kind of gifts will rise to the top, but it won't be on the basis of whether your family has descended from kings or aristocrats or been property holders, right? So that's part of what Americans are thinking about. And by this time, in 1826, we would say the Enlightenment has become a fait accompli. And we might also think about the fact that, therefore, the moment of the Declaration of Independence, moving up from there through the Constitution and into the early national period, is the moment of the American Enlightenment. And that, therefore, you might say, this country is founded on the principles of enlightenment. The Declaration of Independence is often taken to be, and we will talk about it next week, as a statement of the principles of enlightenment. And one of the things to notice about Jefferson, one of the reasons that we look at it, is that we will see that it's a kind of compromise document. I mean, when you read the account of the Declaration of Independence that's in Jefferson's autobiography, you'll see that he's kept in the original because he wants you to see where those damn politicians have made compromises, especially those other Southern ones. But one of the things to say is that Jefferson was not trying to think of anything radically new when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. I think it's a brilliant document rhetorically. I'll be a little harsh about Jefferson a little bit later on today, but I think Jefferson was a brilliant thinker, contradictory, complex. But what he tried to do with the Declaration of Independence was create a document that you wouldn't be able to argue with because it embodied common sense, the common sense of the Enlightenment. And one of the things to say is whenever anybody invokes common sense, it's always, in some sense, the height of ideology. So by looking at a document that is supposedly embodying common sense, we can learn a lot about the moment in which it was written, the kind of assumptions behind that moment. All right? So there are certain doctrines that come with Enlightenment thinking. Among them is this, which would be almost a direct counter to the Puritanism that we've been looking at, the natural goodness of human beings. Puritans say they might have been good once, but that didn't last very long. Enlightenment thinkers don't tend to believe in the total depravity of humankind. In fact, they believe in its opposite, in the perfectibility of the human race. So it would have, you can imagine we're getting a 180-degree shift here, away from total depravity, embracing something that might look to a Puritan like the Arminian heresy. We can perfect ourselves. Good works can be rewarded. There's an emphasis on reason in the ways that I suggested to you. Reason is a divine faculty. Many are, and this can, it can end up in different variants. We'll talk about some of these next week. But for many thinkers, it's still compatible with belief in God because it's God-given. But what Jefferson's quote is telling us, really, is that along with all these things, we need a doctrine of equality. Equality before the law, based in the right to individual liberty. So there's a system of natural rights which the Enlightenment puts into place. Once you have equality, you already start to understand you need to be tolerant of other people. So this is also a moment where there's a greater emphasis on religious toleration, by which we usually, in the American context, would mean something like toleration for various kinds of Christian belief, which I suppose is a step forward. And along that, an idea of universality, or you might say the universal brotherhood of all rational beings. And I use that term brotherhood intentionally because, again, there's a certain way in which many of these ideals are expressed in terms that are resolutely masculine. And it's an open question as to whether these thinkers actually believe that women could participate in Enlightenment thinking as fully as men could. And that's, you might say, a problem that is sort of set aside by the founding documents of the country and left to be dealt with later on. And along with that, the idea of science and progress. Right? If reason is divine, the application of reason to the data and material observations that we might make is also divine, and so therefore science is something that is emphasized throughout all of this rhetoric. Right? So these are some of the key principles of the Enlightenment that I think we would want to keep in mind. Now, just to give you a sense of how this will translate into poetic practice, which is our subject for today, I want you to take another look, or a closer look, at something that I mentioned to you before in conjunction with the metaphysical poets. And I was suggesting to you when I cited Johnson and asked if any of you had read it in Brit Lit 2, that the idea was to understand something about metaphysical poetry and how it worked. Now I'm asking you to look at it from a slightly different point of view. I'm asking you to think about what kind of assumptions about the nature of poetry and intellectual thought lie behind this. So in a sense, this is an 18th century text. We used it to try to get an insight into a 17th century set of texts, but now I want to think about the 18th century, right? So this is what Johnson writes from the life of Cowley. Wit, like all other things subject by their nature to the choice of man, has its changes and fashions, and at different times takes different forms. About the beginning of the 17th century appeared a race of writers may be termed the metaphysical poets, of whom in a criticism on the works of Cowley it is not improper to give some account. And Johnson is one of the great 18th century prose stylists, so we'll get a chunk of it here. I want you to see how it works. And I'm going to ask you, when we're through with this kind of set of paragraphs here, to tell me what you think are some of the literary values that the prose itself would seem to exemplify. It is not improper to give some account. The metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor. But unluckily resolving to show it in rhyme instead of writing poetry, they only wrote verses, and very often such verses as stood the trial of the finger better than of the ear. For the modulation was so imperfect that they were only found to be verses by counting the syllables. What does that mean? Just so we're all clear. What's he talking about? Yeah.
It basically reads like prose except for that it's in iambic pentameter.
All right, so that technically it's poetry because why? It scans. Theoretically, right? That's what he means by the finger better than the ear, right? You can see the beats, but it doesn't sound good, right? So that's something to bear in mind. There's something to do, that poetry has something to do not only with metrical measurements, but something to do with the way things sound. Modulation is what he calls it. Okay. If the father of criticism, by whom he means Aristotle, if the father of criticism has rightly denominated poetry an imitative art, right? Aristotle talks about the principle of mimesis, art as representation through imitation. These writers will, without great wrong, lose their right to the name of poets, for they cannot be said to have imitated anything. They neither copied nature nor life, neither painted the forms of matter nor represented the operations of intellect. Those, however, who deny them to be poets allow them to be wits. Right? So again, we were thinking about metaphysical poetry. Dryden wants to say poetry on the one hand, wit on the other, and the twain rarely meet. Dryden confesses of himself and his contemporaries that they fall below Donne in wit, but maintains that they surpass him in poetry. If wit be well described by Pope as being that which has often been thought but was never before so well expressed, that's one definition of wit, right? They certainly never attained nor ever sought it, for they endeavored to be singular in their thoughts and were careless of their diction. But Pope's account of wit is undoubtedly erroneous. He depresses it below its natural dignity and reduces it from strength of thought to happiness of language. Okay, so there's a way in which Johnson is being critical also of some of the poetic practices of his day by, the poet of the day, the one that is thought to be the model, very model of the modern major poet, Pope. If by a more noble and more adequate conception that be considered wit, which is at once natural and new, that which, though not obvious, is upon its first production acknowledged to be just, if it be that, which he that never found it wonders how he missed, to wit of this kind the metaphysical poets have seldom risen. Their thoughts are often new, but seldom natural. They are not obvious, but neither are they just. And the reader, far from wondering that he missed them, wonders more frequently by what perverseness of industry they were ever found. But wit, abstracted from its effects upon the hearer, may be more rigorously and philosophically considered as a kind of discordia concors, a combination of dissimilar images or a discovery of occult resemblances in things apparently unlike. And then the final famous statement. Of wit, thus defined, they have more than enough. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together. Nature and art are ransacked for illustrations, comparisons, and allusions. Their learning instructs, and their subtlety surprises, but the reader commonly thinks his improvement dearly bought, and though he sometimes admires, is seldom pleased. All right. That's a chunk of prose, very Johnsonian prose. What literary values does it seem to embody? Does it promote not only by what it says, but we consider what it says, but how it says it? You could do both of those things, what and how. What literary values is, if we were going to discern what neoclassicism is as a set of principles from just this passage, what would we say about it? If anybody needs me to go back to a phrase, I can do that. Yes?
Well, do you want to tell what kind of
Do I want you to what?
Well, just to say he uses a lot of antithesis.
Okay.
And a lot of.
What's an antithesis? Can you think of? I think there's probably a better one.
They are not obvious, neither are they just. And there was another one before the other one, but I forgot where it was. They certainly never attained or ever sought it, something like that. Where it's I can't explain it right now.
All right. What's antithesis? What do you mean? You're right about antithesis. He uses it a lot. What is antithesis?
It's it's a proposition that denotes a direct contrast to the original proposition. So it says something, but then kind of contrasts it.
Let's look at this one. If the father of criticism has rightly denominated poetry an imitative art, these writers will, without great wrong, lose their right to the names of poets, for they cannot be said to have imitated anything. Right? So that is an antithetical setup in which you say, this is what poetry is, these people are not that. And you might say that one of the things that comes along with various kinds of antithetical statements is a certain sense of balance. Right? This, but not this. This, but not this. Antithesis, in Johnson's prose, antithesis often goes along with parallelisms. You have parallel statements set up. So what might we say about that kind of prose? I mean, antithesis also smacks of a certain kind of philosophical argumentation, right? So the prose immediately, in its very diction and syntax, is presenting itself as somewhat philosophical, even to a sentence like this one. About the beginning appeared a race of writers that may be termed metaphysical, of whom, in criticism of the works of Cowley, it is not improper to give some account. It is not improper, right? That's a double negative. It might almost be considered to be a litotes. What's a litotes? literary interpretation folk need to talk to them about no light toadies. Yes?
It's like saying like not bad instead of good.
Okay, so what does not bad instead of good mean?
You're like
It's even better than that. It's just like you do something that's fabulous and you go, not bad.
you like underestimate it, I guess, for more.
Okay, that's good. Underestimate, we would say it's a form of understatement, right? That makes use of a double negative construction. So by understatement, it means it means really good, actually. It's not just good. If you're saying, if it's a Lytodius, you say not bad. It's a way of indicating that you think it's really good. This is, I'm not sure if we would count that as, but it's almost that. It is not improper to give some account. But see, just have to think about yourself. There's a certain kind of formality. It makes it sound kind of philosophical. It gives it a certain kind of authoritative finality, and then he can go on to explain that account. So Johnson's prose is all about kind of balance, what he would call decorum. Right? It's about carefully balanced sentences. And even, I think there was a typo on one of them because it didn't read quite right. But there's a sentence in here where he talks about this one. If by a more noble and more adequate conception, that be considered wit which is at once natural and new, that which, though not obvious, is upon its first production acknowledged to be just, if it be that which he that never found it wonders how he missed, to wit of this kind the metaphysical poets have seldom risen. And that's a very strangely convoluted sentence. I don't think it actually quite works. I actually think there's something wrong in it, although I can't figure out what it is. But even if we had it all perfect up here, I think we would say that he's doing a kind of balancing act for a certain kind of emphasis. Right? He wants to juggle rhetorically certain things till he gets to this. To wit of this kind, the metaphysical poets have seldom risen, to give that further emphasis. So Johnson is a prose stylist who is above all interested in a certain promotion of a certain kind of decorum. It's exactly that kind of decorum that he says the metaphysical poets don't have. The most heterogeneous ideas are yoked by violence together, or you wonder by what perverseness of industry these metaphors were ever found. I mean, who ever thought of lovers as the feet of a compass? What is that? What is that? The legs of a compass. Who would have thought of that? Does that make sense? Does it really tell us anything? Johnson would say no. So one of the things we might say is that for thinkers like Johnson, who are talked about as neoclassical thinkers, you say they are in some sense interested in going back to the moment of Aristotle, to thinking very seriously about the kinds of principles of writings that Aristotle espoused and that you could find in other works of the classical Greek and Roman periods. Right? So it's a neoclassicism. It's a new classicism, and it accompanies the Enlightenment because it seems to be the translation into poetic practice of certain kinds of Enlightenment ideals. Right? So they start with the idea of imitation from Aristotle, meaning poetry is mimetic. Right? They therefore think that poetry ought to imitate human life. And what they want to do is to assimilate certain classical genres and make them sort of more modern, or rewrite them for the modern age, which is the 18th century. So in part the epic, but even more some of the minor classical genres. This becomes their way of reconstituting what they think of as ancient literary values, right? So you can see that. Now, how is this connected to Enlightenment thought? Well, you might say that if we are outside of the tyranny of Christianity as a cultural system, we are now free to explore some of the ideas that people like the Calvinists wanted us to shut down. We can go back to the Greek past and rethink the meaning of some of their ideas. This is coming right after two things, right? First, the achievement, which anyone who is a thinker about English letters in this period would acknowledge, the achievement of Milton in Paradise Lost. So really epic, they're not going to do so much epic, because that's kind of hard to get beyond the achievement of epic, of Milton. To us, I think in this period, to a lesser extent, Shakespeare, but that's also looms large. Shakespeare as, in some sense, the great master of the drama. Drama is going to be a little bit harder to really conquer, and some of the 18th century people don't try it as much. And also, they are reacting against what we might think of as the achievement of the metaphysical poets, right? They don't like it. They think it's undisciplined. Instead, they'd rather have what they call decorum or restraint. So simplicity, impersonality, decorum, right? That sense of impersonality, it would not be amiss too. It would not be improper too. creating a certain sense of authority, you might say, that is really grounded in the self, but you try to mask that rhetorically. And a reaction against various kinds of ornament, obscurity, excess of personality. So you don't want something like Donne's poetry. That's the whole point of Johnson's life of poetry. What you want instead is a kind of truthful representation of nature. And in kind of larger terms, and this is what really squares it with the Enlightenment, the idea of humanism. That in some sense what we are interested in is the development of humankind through various kinds of forms, but poetry would be one of them, right? And as a result of that, it draws on some of the ideas of the Enlightenment. The idea of universal brotherhood that I talked about becomes an idea about the power of the universal rather than the particular. We're more interested in what is universally true than in weird little case studies. One of the things that Johnson says in his preface to Shakespeare is that Shakespeare is a master precisely because he is able to address the species whenever he is depicting an individual. In other words, all of his characters seem unique, Hamlet, Macbeth, whoever, and then you realize that they are embodying some larger set of traits which we can recognize in human beings as a whole, right? So Shakespeare manages to do both. He gives you the individual and the species, and that's his almost unique genius. Poetry finally should be didactic. I mean, you go back to this last thing that he says, the improvement is dearly bought. So metaphysical poets, yeah, they teach you something, but it's dearly bought, it's expensive. You spent a lot of your own mental capital on it. Why? Because you admire it, but you're not pleased by it. Didactic poetry should be didactic for a neoclassical thinker, but it should instruct by pleasing. It's one of the important things. In other words, you want to create an art that is pleasant to the ear. It goes down smooth, and therefore you ingest, as it were, the principles behind it much more easily. Just a spoonful of sugar makes the verses go down, right? So that's basically, in a nutshell, some of the principles of English neoclassicism. I think you can see them. I'll put these quotes up for you, and I think you'll be able to see that some of these principles are, in fact, embodied in Johnson's writing. All of this stuff makes its way over to the Americas, starting, you might say, in the time of Edwards, and then becomes a large part of American revolutionary discourse and the discourse of the early national period. In fact, poetry is pretty much everywhere in the early national period. It's funny to think about it, but there's a way in which the period of the founders was maybe it's the high point of American intellectual culture, right? I mean, there's a sense in which people were reading and talking about ideas. People, right? There were fewer of them and fewer of them who got to count as people. But leave that alone. We would say that there was, the life of the mind was evident in the popular culture. So poetry was everywhere. You would find it in newspapers. You would find it in public performances. You would find it in broadsides, like this one. Like the defense of Fort McHenry is a broadside. It was published in a large, by which I mean a large sheet of paper that was published, made available for sale very cheaply, or even posted someplace, right? So you would say that poetry was kind of everywhere, and it was at all kinds of occasions. Somebody died, you just made a poem. Somebody was born, you made a poem. Somebody got married, you made a poem. Somebody did something else, you make a poem. Anybody remember Huckleberry Finn? I forget what her name. What's her name? That character that he satirizes about halfway through the novel, who's always writing poems for every occasion. It's in the whole Grangerford, the feud episode. There's this woman who just kind of writes poems at the drop of a hat. She's always writing these poems for everybody. That's a satire of you might say, the tail end of this kind of public culture of poetry. But what I want you to understand is that poetry still doesn't mean what we think poetry means. Right? If I said before that Puritan poetry was a kind of oxymoron, and that then it starts to open it up a little bit, and that there's a tension within the work of Bradstreet, for example, between the doctrinaire theological impulse and a kind of more personal impulse to explore both earthly love for your husband, grief when your children die or when the house burns down. There's that kind of tension. It's still very much a tension between what we might think of as public and private lives, and that's still going on in this period. So poetry is the site of private imaginings or lyric or working out problems in your head. No, That's not what it is. Poetry in this period is thought of as public, communal, didactic. It's out there in public. It's part of the social life of this period. And therefore, some of even the great poets are reinterpreted to be these kinds of public poets, right? So Shakespeare is thought of in the early national period, for example, as a great writer because he's a writer who constantly opposes tyranny of all kinds. You know, he depicts the problems of Macbeth, becomes a kind of cautionary tale to the English monarch of, and people still talk about this today, about what goes wrong when you abuse power, right? Shakespeare becomes that. Milton becomes a friend of religious liberty who's trying to open Puritanism up to a larger audience and uses the form of epic. And so one of the things we might say is that the Augustan style in England during the first half of the 18th century is precisely what makes its way over to the Americas throughout, and it becomes important throughout the early years of independence, right? And we might think of the directions that Joel Barlow gives for making poetry for making pudding in the Hasty Pudding. Let me see. I think there's somewhere around line 310, this stanza here. Some with molasses line the luscious treat, and mix like bards the useful with the sweet. A wholesome dish and well-deserving praise, a great resource in those bleak wintry days when the chilled earth lies buried beneath deep in snow and raging Boreas drives the shivering cow. A wholesome dish, right? Bards mix the useful with the sweet. That's what poetry is supposed to do. It's supposed to please, but it's also supposed to instruct by pleasing. And part of what the poets who are writing in this period are trying to do is create something that we might call a kind of American national poetry that will, in some sense, celebrate some of the great achievements of American culture up to this date. So, you know, something like the life of Washington or battles of the Revolution were popular subjects for poetry in the early national period. A couple of things, though. In England, because it had an aristocracy and continues to have an aristocracy, if you were a poet, you would be part of a patronage system, right? I mean, typically you would think that a poet is either going to be, there's one of two models. Poet is either going to be some nobleman, like Sir Philip Sidney, who's got, you know, time to write because, well, he doesn't have to earn a living, so he's got time to write in his leisure time, or someone who is a kind of impoverished artist figure who then finds a great man to be his patron and therefore is sustained as a kind of part of court to be or to produce verses. So you have a system of patronage. Doesn't work in revolutionary America and in the early national United States, right? There's no more aristocracy, right? We're not going to be booted and spurred anymore, but we're also not going to pay you for making poetry. So there's a kind of problem there, you might say. Increasingly what's going to happen, and this will be a subject for us over the next couple of weeks, is that one of the things that's becoming emergent in this period is a system that we might call the literary marketplace, in which poets and novelists are going to realize that they've got to figure out how to sell their stuff if they want to continue to write it and make a living for it. And it's difficult enough for the novel. We will see. There are Charles Brockden Brown, whose wonderful Gothic novel Edgar Huntley we're going to read in a little bit, tries and fails to make a professional career out of being an imaginative writer. Washington Irving is the first one that really manages to do it. It's even harder for poets, right? So that's another thing that they get, along with these ideas of style, philosophical content, didactic poetry. It's also certain models for what it means to be a poet. And the problem is that neither of these models, neither the gentleman amateur or the hanger-on or the someone who has aristocratic patrons quite fit the actual situation that you have in the United States in the early national period, right? So that's part of what we'll see, I think, in a couple of the lives that we're going to be talking about today. All right, let's talk about this thing. The defense of Fort McHenry. This, if you look at the head note of it, it tells you, I'll give you the link so that you can find this. I think it's from the, I can't remember, Maryland Historical Society has a copy of this. It says the annexed song was composed under the following circumstances. A gentleman had left Baltimore in a flag of truce for the purpose of getting released from the British fleet. A friend of his who had been captured at Marlborough. He went as far as the mouth of Patuxet and was not permitted to return, but lest the intended attack on Baltimore should be disclosed. And the British admiral had boasted that they would take the fort in no lickety-split, no time at all. He was therefore brought up to the bay to the mouth of the Patapsco, where the flag vessel was kept under the guns of a frigate, and he was compelled to witness the bombardment of Fort McHenry, which the admiral had boasted, there it is, he would carry in a few hours, and that the city must fall. He watched the flag at the fort through the whole day with an anxiety that can be better felt than described, until the night prevented him from seeing it. In the night he watched the bombshells, and at early dawn his eye was again greeted by the proudly waving flag of his country. The British were in fact repulsed, and the naval occupation of Baltimore doesn't happen. Tune, Anacreon in Heaven. Again, that was a drinking song popular in an English club called the Anacreontic Society. I think it's written by this guy, John Stafford Smith, for the Anacreontic Society. And this is a copy of the manuscript. This is definitely in the Maryland Historical Society. Okay, I want to read it, and then I want to think about how it does. Well, think about what it does and how it does what it does. I think it's a slightly cut off on the side, but I think we can read it well enough. And if you have it, you might find it easier to look at it on paper, actually, if you printed it out. Can somebody read it for me? Yes, loudly and with... Yes, I do want you to read the whole thing. Now, okay, as I want you to read the whole thing, and I want you to pay attention as she does it to the ways in which certain elements of the poem are repeated, but with a difference. Immediately, you should notice something about the first stanza that most people listening to the Star-Spangled Banner do not know. Take it away.
The rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave, o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. On the shore dimly seen through the mist of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected now shines in the stream. 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home in a country, shall leave us no more? Their blood has washed out their foul footsteps' pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror or flight or the gloom of the grave. And the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Oh, thus be it ever when freemen shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be our motto, in God is our trust. And the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Give her a hand, please. Excellent. Well done. And of course, what was in the Tom Clancy movie was that last bit. Then conquer we must when our cause it is just, and this be... Okay. By the way, I went back and got the DVD with the commentary. There are 2 commentary tracks, one with Clancy and the director, one with the director and the screenwriter, looking for some interesting tidbits about why they chose this. Alas, none to be found, so don't bother unless you... The movie's fine, as a kind of thing. It's one of these movies where you say, oh, they're not going to do that. Oh, they really did that. Wow, okay. And then the movie goes on from there. But Clancy was more concerned about the incorrect direction that the president's motorcade was driving, when they're getting to the stadium, because he's from Baltimore. And the director was like, gee, I didn't even know that there was another verse. So, no, I have yet to find out why that's in there or whose idea it actually was. What do we notice about the first stanza? Yes? It ends in a question, right? I mean, when Whitney Houston is singing that, does that sound like a question to you? It's like, no. I mean, there's often that flourish at the top when they go up, It's a question. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the home of the free and the land of the free and the home of the brave? Asking a question. Now, let's look at the things that are repeated in the poem. What is repeated in the poem? Okay, so this stuff, like the last couplets. Oh, say, does that star brave? What is it here? 'Tis the star-spangled banner, oh, long may it wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. Then, and the star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. And then finally, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. What's going on there? What's different amongst those lines? Yeah.
Well, in stanza 2, it's more of like a discovery.
Okay.
And that it'll keep waving. And then in 3, it's saying, establishing that there is triumph in the moment and it doth wave. But then in the 4th, it's looking to the future that it shall.
Good, very good. So we have a difference in mood of the verb and in tense, right? Interrogative here. Questioning. Declarative but somewhat subjunctive or conditional here. Oh, long may it wave. To firmly declarative. The star-spangled banner in triumph doth wave, to something that we might think of as future tense or even prophetic. It shall wave. Right? So just in that little change, we can see a progress. And that progress is from questioning uncertainty to certainty, right there. That's the process of enlightenment. And then something else. You might say the projection of enlightenment out. This be our motto, and God is our trust, and the star-spangled banner in triumph shall wave, right? Conquer we must when our cause it is just. But I want you to think also about the pattern of imagery that we've got here. Because as the head note, right, this head note tells you the story. I mean, he's looking at this, again, we don't hear this song anymore because it's so overplayed, and there was a period of time when many of us in the country didn't really like hearing it played because it reminded us of a particular version of American patriotism that might not have been the particular version of American patriotism that we believed in. Easier these days, maybe. In any case, it's also something you grow up with. You kind of, I'm not like Ramona the Pest. Ramona the Pest? Dawn's Early Light? Come on. Ramona the Pest? Any of you ever read those Ramona books when you're growing up? She kind of hears it and she's like, what's a Dawnzer? Dawn's Early Light. It's just syllables. So to hear it again, we need to see it in some way, to hear it again, to see what it's doing. It's asking a question, right? It's nighttime. The fort is being bombed. If the fort falls, the British take over the city. How do you know if the fort falls? The flag, right? The Star-Spangled Banner is a flag. So you're looking to see if the US flag is still up there or if it's going to be replaced by the British flag. And imagine the scene at night. It's dark, and you can't really see. So you've gone from light to dark, and with dark comes not enlightenment, but obscurity, questioning, uncertainty. There are flashes of illumination. Whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, or the ramparts we watched so gallantly streaming? The rocket's red glare gave proof through the night. So, boom, flash, you can see that the flag is still there. Boom, flash, you can see that the flag is still there. And then what happens? You get through the night, and gradually you have the coming of the dawn, you have the rising of full light, and when you have the rising of full light, you get a literal process of enlightenment. And what's disclosed? That the flag is still there. Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam, in full glory reflected, now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner. Right? And now you have that certainty that you didn't have before. So the poem's movement, it's not only about a battle, but there's a way in which the battle becomes a kind of metaphor for this process of enlightenment that goes along with the kind of philosophical underpinnings of the early national period. How can we move from questioning and uncertainty to certainty? What will give proof through the night? And you might think of this more generally as not just being about this specific battle, but about being about the larger national project of the United States. And eventually, almost predictably, you move into a kind of prophetic mode, right? The battle is pretty much over there, right? We see that the flag is still there. We start to think about all the sacrifices that have been made. And then we go into a prophetic mood. Thus be it ever, when free men shall stand between their loved home and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven-rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must. Okay. So I want you to see that that's the larger pattern of the poem. And part of the trick of the poem is to do it through the tenses and moods of its verbs in the last couplets, moving from questioning to the subjunctive, to the fully declarative, to, you might say, the future tense or prophetic. Who wants to scan a line or two? Anybody? How about second stanza? I think that's easy. On the shore, dimly seen, through the mists of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. What is that which the breeze o'er the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? On the shore, dimly seen, through the mists of the deep.
Is it a trochaic tetrameter?
Trochaic. All right. How would that scan out?
I would be guessing the wrong one just because it's unstressed, unstressed, stressed.
Wait. Say that again.
Unstressed, unstressed, stressed.
Okay. Unstressed, unstressed, stressed on the shore. What's the next one?
Again, unstressed.
Unstressed, unstressed, stressed. What is that? It's not a trochee. It's an anapest. Yes. This is anapestic tetrameter, a rare meter in English. It's called the galloping rhythm. And you can see why. It gallops, it moves on the shore dimly seen through the midst of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes. I mean, he can throw in a spondee or two periodically. But it's different than the kind of stately rhythm of heroic couplets. Dun 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 dun. Right? No. Dun 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 dun. So that's another one of the tricks of the poem, right? It gives you that sense of drama, of kind of heightened passion, precisely through its use of metrical feet. Anapest, for the scavenger hunt, Anapest and this poem are now out of bounds. You can't talk about Anapest in the defense of Fort McHenry. Oh well. There are other anapests to be found, but this is the most famous example in U.S. literature that I know of anapestic tetrameter. Right? So by that we mean 4 anapestic feet. On the shore, that's one, dimly seen, through the mists of the deep. Okay. Questions or thoughts about this? Anything else to say? I don't know if I've made you think about this differently, but you can see that it's a very complicated poem, and it's a poem that repays thinking. I think it's a good example of both neoclassicism and even more so Enlightenment thought. Less good of it's not as good an example of neoclassicism as the poetry by Phyllis Wheatley, in part because it gets away from the kind of stately iambic pentameter that Wheatley picks up from Alexander Pope. So in that sense, in terms of its metrical form, I don't think the defense of Fort McHenry is as typical. But in its themes of enlightenment, its belief that poetry can be public and didactic, and that through the way in which its meter works to kind of sweeten that message, I think it is a very good example of neoclassical poetry. All right, Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley is an interesting character because she is both the most neoclassical of poets and the most exceptional of poets in the neoclassical period. Why would that be? In what ways is she exceptional? Yeah, I'm back. Well, she was a slave. Okay, that's true. Anything else? Yes. And she was a she, yes, right? So in both senses, I mean, again, we have, just think of her as belonging in part to a tradition that would include Mary Rowlandson and as a poet, Anne Bradstreet. Right? Bradstreet is also trying to carve out a space for female poetic practice. Don't worry, I'm not threatening your epic poets, and don't worry about it. I'm going to carve out my space. And while, as I suggested, it was a kind of subversion of normal poetic expectations on Bradstreet's part. So Wheatley belongs to that kind of tradition. One of the things that we might say is that it's important for her to have this identity. So, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis is the name of the ship on which she came. Note the spelling, there's no Y in it. Wheatley is her master. Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England. And this is published according to an Act of Parliament 1772. So it's published in London, right? In London, and that's important. So, Wheatley is exceptional in that way. Why would she therefore be the most, in some sense, paradigmatic neoclassical poet?
Well, it was abnormal for females to have that extent of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
She's reaching truth and wisdom in her knowledge and also in her poetry.
Okay, so she's aspiring to some of the values of the neoclassical. She's looking for truth and wisdom in her poetry. Yeah, let's do a little bit more with it. Do you want to add? No? Anybody? Yes?
She's kind of a perfect example of someone becoming enlightened, getting taken over from
Very good.
America, which is not at all Christian, and brought over and taught the way of God. Right?
Okay, in fact, let's look at that. It's, we can read the whole thing just at once because let's just talk about the way this works. You want to read it out loud?
Sure. 'Twas mercy brought me from that pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. One's eye redemption neither saw nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train.
Thank you very much. So what is this? This is exactly about that process of enlightenment that you're referring to, right? Where was she?
She was in Africa.
And what was she when she was in Africa? What's the adjective she uses? Pagan is one. Benighted. Benighted, right? That means what? She's ignorant, but it means literally in the dark. And when she comes, she's no longer benighted, she's in the light. So it draws on the same tropes of enlightenment that we see in Jefferson's paragraph, that we see in the defense of Fort McHenry. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, right? Bless you. So, what else might we say about this? There's a kind of trick in this poem. As I said, there were some tricks in the other poem. There's a trick in this one too. What is it? Yeah.
That she may not be entirely grateful for the way that she was brought into America because she says, remember Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train.
Okay, what would you do with that?
I feel like it's the direct address that becomes so accusatory and becomes
Accusatory of what, though?
of her still not being appreciated in the society that she lives in.
That's correct. I think that's right. Clearly we see there's a problem here that she's addressing. But does that idea, if it's there, that there's some blame that Christians have to accept, does that contradict that idea? That 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land? Would she rather have stayed there, according to this poem? No, you're right. You don't think so? There's no evidence in the poem to suggest that she has ambivalence about that. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Boom. Period, right? So that's a sentence. Boom. Half of the poem. Second half of the poem, as you're pointing out, has a kind of turnaround to it. Some, and we don't know quite who those some are yet, some view our sable, look at all the words for blackness there. Some view our sable wraith with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Right, again, I think I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Ishmael and Moby Dick, that some people thought that that people from Africa were descendants of the race of Cain and that they were marked in that way. That might be one thing. They might be descendants of Ishmael, so that they are also still from the outcast. In other cases, there were various ways of thinking biblically about why it would be okay to enslave Africans. Their color is a diabolic, just maybe black, Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. The trick is in the second half of the poem. Yeah?
It just seems so racist,
It-
what you're writing, because it's not saying that you should be accepting. It should be that you should be telling Christians that blacks can be refined. Say that there is something innately wrong with them, that they're not, before being affected by the Christians, and they're not refined, they are black as Cain.
Yeah.
Especially calling it the angelic train, as if Christianity is the angelic train and everything else is off the train.
We would say it was racist if... I suppose we would say it's racist if you think there's something wrong with black people, just because there is. Wheatley actually thinks there's something wrong with black people if they come from Africa, and the reason there's something wrong with black people if they come from Africa was because they neither redemption, neither sought nor knew. In other words, Wheatley is a person of her, you might say her context. She's Christian. She's really Christian. She thinks it's good to be Christian. I mean, again, this is some of the power, right? She's a neoclassical poet, but you still see the power of Christianity in her thinking. I mean, she writes the poem to the Reverend Whitefield, who I'll talk a little bit more about next time. Again, it's part of her commitment to Christianity. So what's wrong with black people is if they came from Africa, they didn't know God. So that was a mercy. That was God's, you can think of Roland, God has punished me. God has been merciful to her because he brought her, and she's not talking about exactly how that happened, but it was a mercy. It was difficult, but she's gone through it. So it's that same kind of Rowlandson-like logic. That's not what the problem is. The problem is this, that some view our sable race with scornful eye, period, as if there were a period. Their color is a diabolic dye, period. That's it. That's where they stop. Where does she go? She goes further than that period. Right? Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Now, you may say, that you're right to say that suggests that there's something wrong with black people. I would say that the basis of what's wrong is that race, however. The basis of what's wrong is that they haven't yet been redeemed. What's wrong with the Christians, in italics, is that they seem to have either forgotten or willfully wished to deny the fact that Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. Right, so the racists are here, but I would argue that the poem is not racist. The poem is actually an attack on racists who believe that black peoples or African peoples cannot be Christianized. And she would say that everyone can be Christianized. But if you wanted to take the extra leap and say, but wait a minute, why does everybody have to be Christianized? Can't they be something else? That's not going to happen. I mean, that's not who she was. Some people get upset about that. They say, well, why wasn't she more like, pagan? Why didn't she celebrate her paganism? Or they say of Douglass, why doesn't he become a socialist? Why does he, you'll see, why does he kowtow to a certain kind of economic individualism? These, one of the things we see is the delimitations of cultural context, right? Wheatley is a progressive thinker insofar as she's anti-slavery and anti-racism, but she is a firmly committed Christian. But we still haven't gotten to the trick. What's the trick? Yes?
Well, isn't the way that it's written, in the second to last line, if it were to be addressing Christians, remember Christians, there wouldn't be that comma after Negroes, because they'd be Negroes, black as, it can be read as Christians are included in what's black as Cain.
That's good. That's very good. There is a weird, that's one thing, there is a weird ambiguity about these punctuations. At the very least, you would say there's a suggestion of syntactical complication that makes you pause and wonder. Remember, you freed it the first time, remember Christians, Negroes. Are we addressing the Christians and the Negroes?
Yeah.
No, possibly, but not really, but you have to go back to make sure. Remember Christians, Negroes, but what they've done, what I think you're pointing to, is there's a certain kind of syntactical equivalence created here, right? These are both enclosed by commas, and syntactically they seem to have the same weight within the sentence. And look how the prose slows down there, the poetry slows down. Remember, Christians, Negroes, right? 3 caesuras right there. Slows it down and creates a kind of weird syntactical equivalence between these things, possibly. I mean, actually, no. You would say, remember, Christians, Negroes may be refined and join the angelic train. That's the actual sentence. But the weird punctuation makes you pause and worry a little bit about that. So I think that's one of the tricks, although I don't think it's the trick. Yeah?
There could be referring to some.
Who? Some.
Could be referring to the some. 'Cause,
Yeah, well, who is the some now? We know.
we thought it was Christian.
Well, it still is, right? Some view our sable wraith with scornful eye. They're close. The Christians are clearly being implicated in this, right? Some view, and she's not going to say all Christians. She's not getting it all. Some, but then there's a kind of implications that syntactically, that way too many Christians believe this. Some view our sable wraith with scornful eye. Remember, Christians, and there's a sense in which it's almost assumed that the Christians are not the ones, if they need to remember it, they've forgotten it. That would be the good way of thinking about it. Possibly they're even denying it. That would be the bad way of thinking about it. That's what these are here. The fact that this is probably Christians is diabolic, right? There's the invocation of what seems to be biblical thinking here by these some. That's still not the trick. Now I'm running out of time. I'm going to have to end on this. Yes?
Is that like an antiquated spelling of die? It seems like there's an intentional punning on it. Just kind of
It's possible. Remember what we said about the coin and stuff? That's what they're talking about. There's a pun on die with Y-E and die. I think that's right. And maybe also die too. But I think the pun is that they think that it's not only dyed, they're dyed in terms of their color, but they're stamped that way. So it's final and done. That's not the only pun in here. We're running out of time. Yes?
I think refined is an interesting choice. I think because it has that kind of like Pygmalion view of refined, like cotillions and just becoming better.
Possibly have to do with.
Kind of like industrial sense of like refining like ore.
Very possibly, although we're pre-industrial. But yes, there is that sense of refinement. What needs to be refined?
The
Right, but in life, what are things that need to be refined? I'm not calling on anybody else yet.
what needs to be refined?
Uh-huh. Negroes, you're saying, right? They're black as what? Say it. Right? It's spelled Cain as in Abel. But if you hear it, you don't necessarily hear it that way. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as cane, as in cane sugar, which is related to slavery. Clearly, everybody knows that the sugar trade is one of the reasons for slavery. They're black as cane. They may be refined and join the angelic train, right? So it invokes, the pun is on cane. It invokes the kind of purification of sugar. It also indicts the slave trade, all extremely economical. You didn't believe she could do poetry. You didn't believe that a black woman slave could do poetry. All you have to do is see the way this poem works, and you know that she can. All right, we're going to take up Barlow then next time. I'll work it into one of those 2 lectures. All right, thanks a lot.